Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Matthew Holt. I'm here representing the University of Technology, Sydney. I work for the University of Technology, Sydney's International College, and that's called UTS Insearch. I'm the transnational academic executive there, which means I'm looking after all the international programs they offer. But in particular today, I'm also here to represent the Faculty of Design, Architecture and Building. It's their work I'll be talking about today. I have worked in that faculty before. I have also used to be the Program Manager of Design and Architecture at UTS Insearch. My background is in design. In particular, I'm a design historian and also a visual communicator. I've done a number of book designs, quite a few book designs in fact, and so this is definitely my field. So, what can I tell you about the faculty? So in particular what we have here, what you're seeing in the background here is a work by Professor Anthony Burke, who is from the Faculty of Design, Architecture and Building in the Architecture School. So today I think it will focus on architecture. I think it's one of the great strengths of design, architecture and building at the UTS. Among many other strengths, of course, it is particularly well known for its fashion degree. It's also well known for its visual communication, but also I would like to single out here, if I can, and the animation program. That's becoming, I think, world-class, world standard, and becoming more and more popular, and rightly so. There is also a very interesting, speaking of animation, there's also a very interesting Masters of Animation program which is run at UTS, at the University of Technology, Sydney, and that also has a very well-known studio production company called Animal Logic, and Animal Logic is in situ at the University of Technology, Sydney, and the Masters of Animation program, and to some degree the undergraduate program, feeds directly into that. There's work students can do within that actual company. So it's a very exciting place to be. The distinctive features about the Faculty of Design and Architecture Building is, and in particular the architectural aspect, is that it is very much focused on future practices. In that context, the future of urbanization. There's been a lot of work that the faculty has been doing, in particular on what we're calling, with others, smart cities. Now, smart cities are intelligent cities, cities that collect the information on itself that then feeds back into urban planning. So this is going to be, well, as you can imagine, with the rise of automation, the rise of robotics, the rise of communication and information networks, an increasingly important area for all forms of design. So there is a real focus within the faculty, and in particular architecture and interior architecture, on exactly that: smart cities, international perspective, but also smart citizens. So we see the role of design education today, in fact, is the production, if you like, of smart citizens. There's not much else that design education should have as its goal. It is there to produce citizens, the students of the future, who will be able to address the many and varied but complex issues that will be facing us in the future. And when I say future, I really mean the near future. As we know, there's a whole set of issues, environmental particularly, that are facing us today, and more so than ever before, it is design and design education that will be able to give us the forms of knowledge and the forms, in fact, of practice that are necessary to face those challenges. I think very much the Faculty of Design, Architecture, Building at UTS as a whole, but also the university itself as a whole, is very focused on those challenges, what they are, how to define them, how to explore them, and hopefully to some degree, to a very large degree, actually solve those problems. So the university itself is very focused on innovation. To that end, they're focused on innovation. They focus on, well, what we could call creativity, coming up with new ideas, new solutions, but also how to put them into practice. So there's a lot of connections with industry, a lot of connections with the larger community for that reason. And finally, and something that is not always talked about at design schools, but should be, and that is leadership. What skills do designers need, not just to fulfill projects, not just to fulfill briefs, but actually lead communities of practice, lead NGOs, lead government organizations, and so on around these complex issues and show them, if you like, the path to their solution. So that's the wide remit of design today. Design and design education, I think, is an essential form of contemporary education, if not the essential form. Now, as you know, design combines, for this reason, design combines all aspects of human knowledge. So we have on one level of creativity. We have the aesthetic side, the idea about being able to understand form, but also we have what we might call the scientific side. We have to have the ability to know materials, to understand physical effects, understand space, understand time. And of course, we have the communicative aspect. So design is also about communication. It's not just aesthetics and physics or aesthetics and science. It's also communicating ideas. And as I suggested, it's also to do with perhaps what we're calling problem solving, understanding complex issues. So it has this academic side. So for students today of design, no matter where they go, but particularly in terms of the vision of the university, these are the elements that we need new designers to have, and we're devoted to educating them to that end. Okay, so the faculty has 3 schools, design, architecture, and the built environment. Among them, and among the design, we have the fashion and textiles, who I mentioned before, animation, photography, visual communication, interior architecture, and product design. In architecture, we have also, of course, architecture itself. What in Australian universities, and this is obviously the case in the UK and also to a certain extent in America, design architecture is taught in design departments or design schools. Unlike a lot of other parts of Asia, where it's taught in, say, civil engineering. So we actually think architecture is a design degree, and it's taught that way. That doesn't mean you don't learn about construction. Yes, you do. Doesn't mean you don't learn about materials. Yes, you do. Doesn't mean that you won't learn how to build a building. Of course you will. But it also applies all those issues and ideas and themes I talked about just before, that is particular design to architecture. So you're training as an architect and a designer, there is no difference. There's also been added quite recently in the last few years a landscape architecture degree, which is a very exciting degree. As you could imagine, it's becoming more and more important, especially as I mentioned before with, for instance, the larger cities, the growth of mega cities, the ideas around smart technology, but also around and what seems to be inevitable climate change. Landscape will be an essential, if not, well, it already is, but even more essential part of the way in which we design our cities and experience them. So it's a very exciting degree. And of course, there's the building school as well, and that contains construction and project management, primarily, and property economics. Okay, so like I said early on in the presentation, I'll be focusing today on architecture. Just to set some sort of context around that, I have a couple of figures on the back on the slide here. But perhaps the most important thing about that actual figure is this element here, which says that, well, it's practically 50% of all global construction activity will occur in the Asia-Pacific region by 2020, just a few years away. So effectively half of construction that the world is either undergoing now or will take place in our region. So at the University of Technology Sydney, we firmly believe that Australia's role, and particularly Sydney's role, is within the Asia-Pacific, is within that kind of environment. So you're training with us, for instance, to be an architect in Sydney, but you're training to be a visionary, if you like, within that economy. So, particularly the Asia-Pacific economy, but we also emphasize the entire kind of global perspective. So that's the most important thing about that. Now, about architecture itself, of course, it is about building buildings. It is, of course, about building a house, but it is so much more. I'm not sure if you can actually see this, but I think you can. It also involves a whole set of factors, things, if you like, that are involved in construction, but in the planning of space, in the ways in which we live together, in urban environments, in form. What I mean by that, urban form, what actually things look like, how you interact with them, how you experience them. So architecture in that sense is quite a large notion, a quite expansive notion, and it is treated exactly like that at the faculty. So you'll be introduced to, you'll explore, you'll talk about advanced construction and supply chain system design, for example. So not just the building, but how all the materials are distributed, how they've accessed, what properties they have, and why and how you engage with the companies that produce them and the systems that run them. Systems design is an incredibly important part of any designer's work, because you're not, as a designer, you do not just design an object, you design a system which the object is in. And that goes for visual communication, that goes for product design, it goes for animation. As I said before, design is primarily a form of communication. So you might also then be in the more involved in the finance sector, but also the other side to it, elements of social, we call here social agency. So there's a strong bias in the faculty to projects that and then eventually do good for the communities that they're embedded in. And we encourage students to strongly analyse social conditions, political environments, and so on, in order to make sure that we know why we are designing something, for whom, why, and in what context. So that's very important. And I would like to emphasise that goes for all forms of design, of course. And more, the, if you like, ethical side of design is becoming a greater question, a more important question. We may be more interested in redesigning something rather than just producing something new, for example. It's an important point to remember. You might want to remove something rather than just to add something. So this takes us to the next slide. This is health and sustainability. Again, of course, as you've probably already realized, in many advanced countries, if we can call it that, including Korea, including Japan, and also China, there is an aging population, and that's the same in Australia as well. And people are just generally living longer. We have to account for that. We have to design for that. Can you imagine, for instance, the different kinds of spaces we need to design for that? For an aging population, for an elderly population. Think of all the different kind of product designs one needs for that population. Clearly, sustainability is an issue for us all. But sustainability goes through everything. It goes through messaging or systems. It goes through the actual products themselves. It goes through the supply lines. It goes through all the context of the design itself. So sustainability, I will emphasize here, is not just making something green or painting something green. It's much more complex. So that's a big part of what we're doing. Urban services, well, again, the words here are strategic, integrated urban services. So again, thinking of architecture as the connection between buildings, the broader understanding of urban forms, which of course also involves the systems that connect all those forms, but also the intelligences, which is the systems of information. And so we are looking at not just the flow of products, the flow of goods, but the flow of messages, the flow of information, and how that is all linked together in our cities. Very important, and because the questions become such a large scale, it takes a kind of, if you like, a design mind, if you want to call it that, a designer's brain, to really sort through that complexity. And again, that is something we emphasize. Well, the architectural product development. Well, here I just want to emphasize again that this is about what actually goes into the buildings as well. So what new materials are we using? Or what new materials do we need in the future to make our buildings the way in which they are sustainable, for instance? So there's a big emphasis, I should say, in the faculty, but also in its connection with the industry itself, in exploring new and emergent materials. What are the materials we need to build our buildings? What are the outside, the skins? What are the interiors meant to be like? What are their properties? What kind of relationship will they have with the environment? What kind of thermal conditions, for instance, or acoustic conditions will we face as designers or we face as architects? So that's materials. A lot of work's going into this field, and as I said, so it should. Now, you've also got to explain all this. You have to show people what you're doing. Something that a lot of people tend to forget about architecture, because of course it clearly seems to be about the actual building, 3 dimensions, but is the communication of it. How do we get these ideas across? How do we visualize complexity? How do we visualize the path we want to take to the client? Sure, but that client could be not just a single client, that client could be a whole government body. It could in fact be the government itself. So there's different ways to think about this, but the idea of data design becomes extremely important for 2 reasons. First, it's the information the architect or the designer is receiving. So how do I map the kind of information I need to produce a design? Secondly, it is to communicate the design to the audience, to the user, or to the client. So that's a very much an integral part of all design education. Okay, so going back to the urban theme, going back to the idea of navigation of the city, of the systems I talked about. User experience, in this case we've got here urban user experience, is rapidly becoming a major part of design, you would have already experienced this, of course, through certain developers and certain apps, certain new navigation tools through your phone, all sorts of things. But the main point here is that navigation and information is linked to urban experience. You have to interact with that somehow, and that's what user experience is about, that's what user interface design is about, is the point of interaction. So that's again between the design and the user, the thing and the user. That is the interface, if you like. That's what designers do. They design interfaces. Hopefully clever ones, hopefully simple ones, so it's easy to use, natural to use, and obvious in its meaning and intention. Very, very important in urban design. You can't have complex signs. You might trip over, you might be told to drive the wrong way, all sorts of things. Okay, and having said all that, in fact, it is also about building beautiful buildings. So architecture is, and design, by the way, is also about building things that are beautiful, that are lovely to inhabit, lovely to live in, beautiful to touch, beautiful to listen to experience. So any good designer must have that other dimension. They must also know how to make things feel good for people. Okay, so let's not forget that aspect. All right, so I mentioned before there's a very outward focus, if you like, from the Faculty of Design, Architecture, Building, and of course from the University of Technology, Sydney itself. There's a strategy of being more of part of the world, even more if that was possible. So there's a whole series of exhibitions, events, partnerships, global, what is called global studios that students join across the world to realize and make concrete this international or transnational vision. Design, as you know, today involves partners across the globe. It is no longer designed for just your area or your local community. Your materials might come from the other side of the world. You might be be in Sydney, for instance, or in Seoul, but designing for someone in America or in China, anywhere. So, in fact, the design industry itself is a global industry. So, the students that we produce, the students that we teach, are international themselves, and largely in focus, in an outlook, but also we want them to be international citizens. Okay, so I talked a bit very briefly about the idea of the global studio. It's something that the faculty introduced some time ago, but has really ramped up over the last few years. So a lot of our students, during their undergraduate degree, get to go overseas and join up often with well-known designers or well-known design studios and work there, or they might partner with another university, they might partner with a local community, and they'll spend 2 or 3 weeks in those communities and working on designs, and that will be part of their studies. So there's been global studios in Berlin, students often go to Japan, there's Switzerland, Cape Town in South Africa, Beirut, and so on. Very popular, of course, as you can imagine with architects, is the Los Angeles and New York. But it is a wonderful thing. We also have the intensives the other way, master classes from well-known designers, well-known architects, and well-known academics, and they come to the university. Behind you is a long list, and I will not read it out, but a long, long list of study abroad partnerships. Again, something that we like to emphasize. I'm not sure if you can see at the back there. Here is a picture of the very famous Canadian architect, Frank Gehry, perhaps the world's most famous architect at present. And you may know that at the University of Technology, Sydney, there's a building that's just been opened, well, a couple of years ago, now becoming quite iconic, that Frank Gehry designed for the university. It's the business school, but there was a lot of connections and interaction, as you can imagine, with the architecture school at the Faculty of Design and Architecture building. And so, in fact, it's, a lot of students could have also had the opportunity to go and visit his studio and be part of the design process there. So that was great of Frank Gehry. And that's been an amazing thing for the university and for the architectural community. Something just across the road from the university, which is located in the heart, basically, of Sydney CBD. Right in the kind of innovation precinct, if you want to call it that. Excellent part of town. It abuts Chinatown, so it's great for food. It's a fantastic area. This is the building straight across from the university on the main road there, and it was designed by the very famous French architect, Jean Nouvel. So the whole precinct, if you like, is becoming a kind of architectural wonderland, if you want to call it that, and it's very exciting to be. So, just a couple more slides. Now, a lot of the questions I get, I do travel a lot, and I travel a lot on behalf of the university, and recently on behalf of the faculty I'm talking about. And a lot of parents ask, of course, and quite correctly, what is the opportunities for their son or their daughter to get work after the degree. There's a lot of opportunity, I can tell you now. The creative industries. So you could put, perhaps you could put design and even to a degree architecture within the creative industries, which of course also includes media. Is one of the most important and rapidly becoming even more important elements to any nation's economy. And it has become a real focus, again, of course, of burgeoning or emerging economies, very much so, for instance, of China, very much so, for example, of India. There's a real drive towards becoming a kind of, not just industrial based, but based in what we might call the information economy. And design fits, as I argued right at the beginning of the talk, design fits, is right at the centre of that. Okay, so there's very strong employment opportunities within the general field of architecture and, of course, building. So in property economics and construction management, but also in architecture itself, and we're finding more and more so in landscape. There's a real need for visual communication graduates because, as you can imagine, the extent of what visual communication is ever increasing. All the different platforms we have, all the different interfaces we have. The visual communicator is an essential designer today. And that will include, of course, animation as well. Because things aren't still anymore. It's not a still image. These are moving images we're talking about. So even in print, if you like, print has become the moving image. And again, to emphasize interface design, graphics are now more animated than ever before. So the animation student, of course, is getting more and more work. So then a creative discipline is not a risky prospect, quite the opposite. It's becoming, as I said, key to all contemporary economies and will only increasingly be the case. So we're calling it, and this is not just us but others too, these are the kind of jobs of the future. These are what is called the innovation agenda. The jobs of the future, they say, will rapidly change. So you may move from one job to another more frequently than ever before. There's one element. But also the kind of jobs that are coming or are in the future, even the ones we don't know about yet, we have to be prepared for. And exactly what a design education does, it gives you the skills, the knowledge, as I said, the practical skills, but also the conceptual knowledge to face those forms of change and be prepared for them. So we do think design is a job of the future. It is the job of the future, I would argue. And look us up. This is, do I need a portfolio? Yes, but we're very, very willing to help with that. Okay, so I think that will do. As I said, I'm Matthew Holt, and it's been a pleasure talking to you all, or hopefully a pleasure for you to be listening. And I hope to do it again soon. Thank you very much. Bye now.